One of the things you're going to notice in reading and writing scientific literature is that we will cite absolutely everything. So, as I think I mentioned a few times in the literature search and in the scientific writing lessons and all that sort of stuff, when we write science, we don't necessarily want to go out on a limb and say something that has no support. That's how you get other people yelling at you or saying that you don't know what you're talking about, or really just becoming a person that people don't believe. There are a lot of scientists out there that will just say stuff. And just by the nature of being a scientist, sometimes people believe it. But the problem with that is if you don't have the actual facts and observations and experiments to back yourself up, then you can ruin your reputation. So you make one, ill-advised statement without any support or any literature shield, so to speak, and it becomes a real issue. And then people stop believing what you say. It's a lot harder to build back up that information. So you will find that a lot of scientists are actually pretty conservative when we say things. We don't spend a lot of time going, nope, this is why it is, because we've been burned in the past. Look back through any type of scientific history, and you're going to find that there were things that scientists said back in the day that were then proven false, and now everybody's embarrassed about it. So we've kind of learned our lesson over the past couple hundred years, where when we make an observation and we try to explain something away, we actually need facts to back it up, experiments to back it up, and ultimately literature to back it up. So that goes into the citation issue. When you are writing a paper, any fact that you throw into that paper, as long as it's not one of those things that is really well known, you need to cite your sources. So if you go onto Wikipedia or things like that, there'll be a lot of notation saying citation needed. This is just a quick way of saying, hey, you put something down here that we're not quite sure if it's something you made up in your brain, if it's, again, something that you observed and then tried to explain away, or what's going on there. It's basically a way to keep us from making up more old wives' tales, like we talked about in previous video, and just explaining it away. We're really good as humans at explaining away observations, and that's why you end up reading some really crazy old texts. Oh, quick aside, I'll try to remember to put this up, but start reading some of the really ancient texts on forensics or science or medicine especially. Oh my God. The weird things that they did in there, all because they explained something away. One that I'm thinking of, there's an old textbook by an investigator in China called Sun Tzu, and it's his textbook called The Washing Away of Wrongs, and he was a forensic scientist basically in the 13th century. In this textbook, it's a very thin book. There's not a lot in there. He basically gives step-by-step ways of figuring stuff out when it comes to forensics. The reason that I know it is because it has the first written down instance of forensic entomology. And so this is well known among forensic entomologists. But it also has a whole bunch of other things in there. Now, when you read through it, you can see how, okay, I can see somebody did this thing and they came up with an observation, and now they leapt to this conclusion saying that this is why it happened. So the forensic entomology story goes that somebody was killed with a sickle, a townsperson. This investigator came in and asked everybody in town to lay their sickles, because they were all farmers, in front of them. And the one that all the flies landed on, they were attracted to these bits of blood and tissue that were left over on that sickle. So that was a way to indicate which one of these sickles came into contact with blood or tissue, flesh. And that works. That is in line with our understanding of how flies look for resources. So that worked out. Some of the other stuff in this book, though, it's crazy. So there was one little one-page story on how to bring somebody back from death. And one of the things was if they hanged themselves and you cut them down, you shove green onions up their nose and they'll wake up. Now, I could see how this might happen. Somebody kills themselves and somebody finds them, and maybe, green onions are very pungent. So maybe they thought they would have them sniff it like ammonia or smelling salts or something. And maybe they realized they weren't breathing, so they shove them up their nose, and maybe they woke up. So you see that, and then they go, there it is. The green onions saved them. So it's easy to think through how this possibly happened, but knowing what we know now, that is insane to think about. Can you imagine being a doctor and being like, I'll just shove green onions up their nose? Oh my God. But that's part of the human condition. We think about ways. So back to, go read that book. It's incredible. Anyhow, back to actually citing. So in order to stop ourselves from letting our imaginations run wild with ideas and making connections and going, no, this is how it is. Because as scientists, people will believe you until you make such an egregious lie or an egregious mistake, and then you never get your reputation back. This happens all the time. You need to protect yourself through citations. So a citation is taking a fact that you are putting in writing and showing the reader, look, somebody looked it up. Somebody found it. Somebody's already tested these facts out. And if you want to know more about it, or if you don't believe me, here's where you go to find that information. So when we do citations, we have two places to put them. One, you put the in-paper citations in the body of the paper. And two, you put them in the references. So in-paper citations look like this. And this is based on our author guidelines. We want to have the first and, if there's just two authors, the second one there, and the year that paper was published. You put this right after the fact that you wrote at the end of that sentence. So in this case, you should have a whole bunch of citations in your introduction. So when we go over introductions, you'll learn a little bit more about it. But basically, an introduction is a way to introduce the subject to your readers and to get them on board with you doing this experiment. You sort of lead them down this primrose path, so to speak, saying, hey, look at this thing. And, oh, isn't this interesting? This is an observation that has happened, or this is a video that somebody put out, or this is a little bit of knowledge that people were wondering about. Look, I went and looked it up. Nobody else has done it. So you're trying to prove your due diligence that you actually looked up the answer. You're trying to show how your thought process happened and all the little extra bits of facts that you brought together in order to create your argument. Okay, so when you are writing this, every time you put a fact that isn't really well known, you need to cite it in the paper. In the body of the paper, you need to put these in-paper citations. So if somebody wants to double check you, they can. You want to make sure that every fact that isn't well known is checkable like this. This will simply support your knowledge and really build up your reputation. You are not somebody who is just going to say something that is BS. You are somebody who has gone into the literature, has gone through other scientists' work, taken that information, and now you're proving it. So I always like to say this is a shield. Somebody can yell at you all they want about a fact that you wrote in your paper, but if you have another paper showing somebody has tested that fact, that's not your problem. They can yell at you all you want. You hand them that paper and be like, yell at them, I guess. There you go. I'm not the one who came up with this. This is known in the scientific community. Go and read it. It is such an easy way to shut down somebody who is just angry at something that you said. You have these shields. Now, I keep saying you only cite things that are not well known. So what is a well-known fact? This is a point of contention among different people and that sort of thing. And I do get this a lot with certain students who didn't cite things, and I ding them on citing, and they'll come to me and be like, well, this is well known. What I want you to think about is, if you were to talk to literally anybody outside of science, would they know that fact? So not other scientists necessarily, not somebody who's in the same class. I'm talking, you're walking into Thanksgiving dinner and your grandparents and parents and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and people who don't work in science and whatever else are all there. And you're going to say something to them. If you say something to them, would they know that fact? So I'm thinking facts like humans breathe. That is something everybody knows because we all do it, right? So you don't need to cite the fact that humans breathe, or that the sun rises and sets every day, or that the earth is round, although there's a whole flat earth society thing happening now where maybe we need that. But things of that nature where it's everybody knows it. If you talked to your non-scientific parents or family members, they wouldn't question you and be like, what are you talking about? I've never heard that before. Those are things you do not need to cite. Everything else, though, even if it's something that you learned in your biology classes in college, even that, cite it. Always err on the side of caution with this. So I am much more conservative when it comes to citations than pretty much anything else, simply because it cuts down on the arguments. And since I'm a forensic scientist, I do go and I testify in court and all those sorts of things. And let me tell you, it is so nice to be able to sit on the stand and say a fact like insects show up at dead bodies. And if a lawyer comes to me and asks, I have a list of citations where people have observed it, tested it, retested it, retested it over and over again. They can yell at me all they want, but I can hand over a 50 paper stack showing that this has been observed by different people at different times under different circumstances, tested 7,000 different ways, and the answer has never changed. Even a lawyer can't argue against that. So if you think about that sort of thing, then you should know what to cite. So anytime that you come up with a fact that isn't well known, go and find a piece of literature or an article or a textbook or something that states it. Basically, you don't want to be the one defending that information in your intro. Your job is to set it up so that then it leads the reader to your materials and methods, and then eventually somebody can use your paper because you tested it for one tiny little fact. So what we're looking at here is an article that's been submitted to this journal. Some of you have been already assigned this for peer review, but you'll see that as this person was writing, they stated a few facts. This is information they got while reading a bunch of textbooks and other papers. So in this case, it is saying, in the past, there's been various studies of cross-race identification that aim to determine accuracy of humans being able to recognize, identify members of a different racial background as their own. Okay, so they're saying that people, it's been looked at that humans have the tendency to more accurately identify faces from members of their own race. So you see how that's a fact. It says it's been tested. Humans, white people are much more able to identify different members of the white race or from Caucasian type people. That's really not a great term, but that sort of thing. So it's an intraracial thing going on. Now, if I walked out and just said this without any backup, oh man, there would be pushback, and I would deserve pushback, right? Because I'm just going out and saying a thing. Maybe it's something that was supported by observation, but nobody's ever tested it. This has been tested. So this author was able to put this in here saying, here's something called the cross-race effect. And here is the person that studied it. So if I wanted to know, like, this sounds like BS, or that sounds interesting, let's see how true it is, I can actually go to the reference section, look up this paper, and see what's going on. And then this paper by Mesner and Brigham in 2001 will have even more references in it that I can go and look up. So you can basically go down a rabbit hole, like I talked about with the lit search, and start reading about this one little fact, this one little concept over and over again. Okay, so that is what you want to do when you talk about in-paper citations. Every time you say a fact, that if you can imagine somebody pushing back on it, or imagine a lawyer in court coming to you and saying, prove it, you want to prove it by citations. Err on the side of caution with this. Always cite things, even if you think most people know it. just double check. So what I usually do when I have a pain in the butt student, at times it happens, they come in, they don't cite something, they say, well, everybody knows that. What I'll do is I will walk them to one of our advisors or one of the secretaries, because in our department, the advisors and the secretaries tend to have degrees in education, in HR, in outreach, and that sort of thing. They don't have science degrees. So you want to walk somebody to somebody who is knowledgeable but without a science degree and ask them, do they know this fact? If they have no idea what you're talking about, cite it. You have to prove it. If they do know what you're talking about, okay, we can get away with not citing it. So just keep that in mind. Go and ask somebody, a roommate or whoever that is not in the sciences, and say, do you know X, Y, and Z? So for this example, I would walk up to one of the advisors in my office or one of the secretaries or student workers who are really well educated in something else. Because you want to make sure that you're actually talking to somebody who's a little more well educated, simply because that means they tend to not believe a bunch of BS, you know. And I would say, hey, do you know about the cross race effect? And if they did, I'd be like, okay, well, maybe I don't need to cite this. But can you imagine me going up to one of the advisors in literally any department and being like, hey, what's the cross race effect? And they'd be like, what are you talking about? I need to cite it. So that is your litmus test. Ask somebody who doesn't study what you study if they know what this particular fact is without explaining it. You don't want to go into a bunch of explanations so they can get it. Just name the thing. Or, for a well-known fact, like you could go and ask one of these people, where does the sun rise every morning? What direction? Most people would be able to say, oh, it rises in the east, because everybody knows that. You don't need to cite that now. Cool. Or what do humans breathe? What do we need? They say oxygen. Oh, okay. Well, I don't need to cite the fact that humans breathe oxygen. Now, if you were going into the cellular respiration level, you might need to cite that. Little different. Okay, so that's just your good rule of thumb. Cite things that everybody, if you just asked anybody randomly in the department or in your house or whatever, if they wouldn't know what it was, cite it. So these in-paper citations allow me then to read through this introduction and say, okay, here's a fact. I need to know more about this. So researchers determined it was not uncommon that eyewitness accounts may be skewed through external factors such as interviews and memory. Oh, that's interesting. Let me go and get more information on that. So then you go down to your reference section. There's Fisher. Look at this paper, the relation between consistency and accuracy of eyewitness testimony. If I wanted to know more about this, I could go in to this looks like it's a chapter from a textbook, go in and read more about it. That chapter is obviously going to have even more things and even more things. So I just go down that rabbit hole. Okay. So this is why we cite and where and when we cite. If there is ever a question if you should cite or not, cite. It is better to cite something that is well known than it is to not cite something and have somebody push back on you. Because again, you're protecting yourself. If you go and stand up and give a talk on this or somebody reads it, you can get pushback. And I've run into this before. I wrote a book chapter not too long ago where I talked about stuff in forensic entomology. And there's this one scientist in forensic entomology that's kind of a pain in the butt. And he's really contentious, and he goes to conferences and literally yells at people when they're talking, and he can be really obnoxious, and it's awful. So I wrote this book chapter, and he emailed me immediately as soon as it was published and read me this riot act and just went, "You are wrong." And I went, "Well, here's all the papers and citations. So I guess you can believe I'm wrong if you want to." And he had absolutely no response to that. So imagine being able to argue with somebody who is well known to be a bully and can be a pain in the butt and has actually made people cry at conferences. Have him come at you and you just be like, I guess you can yell at me, but that also means you are yelling at these 500 other scientists who have, hundreds of years worth of research under their belt all put together. So it's not just me, it's all of us. And he had no answer to that. It's a protection. And this is what we do in science. We make sure that any fact we're putting forth actually has support. All right. So err on the side of caution, cite things whenever you even have a question about it, and you will be fine. Let me know if you have any questions.